Hello, I'm the Despot of Antrim, and I'm going to talk about the books that I read during November. So the first book I read is Uncle Tom's Cabin. I think it's very good. It's well written. It's written in an interesting, antiquated style. I had never read a book that was written in that style before. The author constantly addresses the reader. Dickens does it a little bit, but Harriet Beecher Stowe does it a lot more. And she has some interesting, antiquated ideas about race, which are also fun to read because people really believed that stuff in the 19th century. And it's a good dramatic narrative, good characters, interesting. It's a important part of American literary history and indeed of American history, since it was important in shaping Northern opinion prior to the Civil War. It's a very long book, and to be honest, it's too long. There are parts of it that really could be cut out. I would say my main criticism of Uncle Tom's Cabin as a piece of literature is that, yeah, she just needs to go in there and trim the fat. There are parts of it where it's just too boring. It takes too long for anything to happen. Nothing much is happening. There's too much talking. There's too much contemplation and reflection. There is constant criticism of slavery, of how evil it is and how bad it is and how terrible it is that these men are in slavery. It's like Harriet Beecher Stowe is using a sledgehammer to crack the walnut of slavery is bad. Yes, we know slavery is bad. You don't need to continue hammering it into the reader on every single page. But I suppose in the 19th century, maybe she thought she did. She felt maybe people didn't actually understand what the slavery system in the United States was like, and that she needed to continually drive the point home. But when you read it today, it does get a bit tiring to hear the same thing again and again and again. But overall, it is a very good book, and if you're interested in that period of history, I would recommend you read it. If you're not at all interested in history, there's no point. It's too long. It's an extremely long book, and if that doesn't interest you, 19th century history, Civil War history, slavery in the United States, don't bother. Just read something shorter. All right. The next book I want to talk about is A Man in Love. It's the second book in Karl Ove Knausgaard's Mein Kampf series. It's mostly about the difficulty of his marriage. So in it, he depicts his wife as a complete cunt, basically. That's certainly the impression that I got. I'm not saying that's true, or that she is or was, just that is how she is depicted in the novel. She's depicted as lazy, as callous, as argumentative. He indicates that all of the arguments are her fault because she's just being sort of passive aggressive or nasty, or she's sitting on her ass when there's a pile of dishes in the sink and he's just got home from work. And he also talks about the difficulty of raising kids, of how that changed his life and how he basically completely lost his free time and his sovereignty as a man. He was no longer a free man. He was completely bound to his family. And that is probably what he's talking about when he refers to my struggle. And I think it's interesting and refreshing that you have a writer who wrote about that, because it's not something you see accurately depicted in media or in culture. It's not an interesting or sexy topic to talk about. There are other interesting aspects of the book, like, for example, he describes a fairly funny war he has with one of his neighbors, a Russian woman, and she really has it in for him, and they are constantly arguing. She's going past his apartment door and trashing the front of his door and things like that, and it's good. It gives the book a bit of levity, and there's also quite a bit of philosophy in there. He describes the philosophy when he is talking to friends and when he's giving his own reflections. It's good. So I strongly recommend it. It's a beautifully written book. Some very interesting and honest reflections on his marriage and his fatherhood. So the next book is Spider Kiss. This is a book that I strongly recommend. It's not long. It's a 1950s novel. I think it was written in 1959, and it describes the rise and fall of a teeny bopper singer. It is excellent. Everything about it. The characters are well written and well fleshed out. The writing is vivid and fun. The moral lessons that the writer is presenting in the book are interesting. And the main character is terrific. He's a singer called Stag Preston. And yeah, he's a really layered, interesting character. And at the end of the book, spoiler alert, he is presented as almost a kind of anti-hero, as a heroic figure or a martyr. He's achieved something really amazing at the end of the book, and that final scene in the book is just brilliant. It's one of the best things I have read this year. That final chapter of A Spider Kiss is excellent. I would strongly recommend the book just for that. It's one of those scenes in a book that is so beautifully written and so vivid that it just sticks in your mind for months after. And there's not many of those. That's just a terrific book, and it's interesting because it was one of Harlan Ellison's very early novels. So I strongly recommend that. It's also interesting because it's part of it's written from someone who lived through the 1950s. So he's writing about the 1950s, not from the sort of modern, sort of Mad Men perspective, the rose-tinted glasses and, look at how weird and fun and different the 1950s was, but more of a realistic depiction of the 1950s. For example, you see a lot of the poverty in the 1950s that was just kind of glossed over in modern media. It's interesting. It's very good. I would strongly suggest you give that book a read. Memos from Purgatory, also by Harlan Ellison. This one is a memoir. Partly, it's divided into two parts. The first part that he deals with his time as a juvenile delinquent. He infiltrated a gang in New York to have something to write about. And the second part deals with his time he spent in the Tombs, which was a jail system in New York. Very well written. You can tell that by the time he wrote that memoir, he had a lot of experience as a writer. He communicates exactly what he wants to communicate very clearly, very vividly. It's interesting. You can follow along easily without getting confused. He doesn't trip up on himself in the writing or the narrative. Very well put together, very well thought out. Would I recommend it? I mean, yeah, especially the first part where he describes being a gang member. That's an interesting little piece of 1950s history. I don't know if it's all true. There's a scene involving a knife fight, which I suspect is embellished, to say the least, if not just made up. But it doesn't matter. It makes for fun reading. The second story, the time he spent in jail, is... I mean, you could skip that one. It's fine. He describes 24 hours he spent in the Tombs. The characters that inhabit that story are quite interesting. He also uses antiquated terms like Negro and fag to describe the people that he was sharing his jail cell with, which is interesting because you're reading when you read those words, you realize you're reading something that is basically from a dead civilization, but quite a recent dead civilization, which makes it a bit more interesting. But yeah, good book. I would recommend more so the first story than the second one when he talks about spending time in the Tombs and jail. It's almost Kafka-esque. The second one's a bit sort of existential Kafka-esque, so if you're into that sort of thing, definitely read the whole thing. But yeah, the time he spent as a gang member, that first story in Memories from Purgatory, that's terrific. Definitely check that out. So the next book is Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. That is his memoir of the time he spent in Spain fighting with the anarchists or communists or whoever the hell he was fighting with. You'll know what I mean if you read the book. The situation in Spain that he describes becomes pretty confusing by the end of the book. There are the anarchists, the socialists, the communists, and they're having these political infighting, and they're sometimes actually shooting at each other in the streets. The situation became such a mess that Orwell actually left Spain, which was an excellent decision, because you don't want to fight for a side when they're actually just infighting against each other. It's typical Orwell, brilliantly written, some very interesting observations. It's not as good a memoir as, say, Down and Out in Paris and London, because it just doesn't contain the same quality of characters. And despite the fact that it's a war novel, it's not as interesting as, say, Down and Out in Paris and London, because most of the time he's just hanging around these poorly constructed trenches near the front, fighting an enemy that's fighting an enemy who are several hundred yards away. They're taking pot shots at each other occasionally throughout the day, but there's not much fighting that's going on. Neither side have big guns. It's kind of peasant warfare. So, but he describes that all very honestly. That's what he says in the book. He doesn't pretend that he was, a big, great, heroic soldier fighting a terrific battle against the evils of fascism. In fact, he said he was very disappointed because he went there hoping to fight fascism, which had just been winning and winning and winning in Europe. And he got there and he ended up in this poorly organized unit that honestly just didn't do that much. He says he doubted he even killed or wounded a single man when he was in Spain, which was very upsetting for him. But very well put together, well described narrative. And if you're interested in 20th century history, pre-Nazi history, or just Orwell, read it. It's great. All right, so the next book I'm going to talk about is Swarm. This is a book by a science fiction author named B.V. Larson. It's the first in his Star Force series, which I read the entire series, and I will do a longer video about that in the future. Basically, Swarm is the best book in the series, definitely. It's because it builds the world that the whole thing happens in, that the whole story happens in. You discover this world and you discover what is going with the characters as it happens, which makes it dramatic and more fun. It's a very fast-paced, fun, interesting, page-turning narrative. It has good characters. They're a bit two-dimensional. The characters are a bit two-dimensional, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's fun, junky, sort of popcorn, sci-fi, military fiction. So if you just want a light, fun, trashy read, Swarm, yeah, fun book. I would recommend it. All right, Octopussy and the Living Daylights. So that was two Bond stories in one book. I was surprised by this because I'd never read any Ian Fleming. I was expecting it to be a sort of really cheesy, badly written, junky Cold War spy novel, which just happened to get famous because they made it into a movie. Actually, it's not. It's really, really good. The characters are interesting. For example, there's a character called, I think he's called Captain Blythe. He's an Octopussy. He's the main guy in Octopussy. What's interesting in Octopussy, actually, is that Bond doesn't really feature in it. He just shows up at the end or in the middle, and he's not there for very long. Blythe is a really interesting character because to him, all he wants to do is eat, sleep, drink, smoke, fuck, and study fishes. As long as he's doing that, he is living the high life. Like, he's got it going on. That is how he views the world. I just thought that was really interesting. And Ian Fleming described that really well, how this very sort of hedonistic view of the good life is embodied in Blythe. And Fleming talks about, the price he paid to achieve that lifestyle, and then Bond shows up to shut it all down. It's great. Really good. The Living Daylights is actually fairly dull. Bond goes to Berlin to work as a sniper during a border crossing operation. Fairly dull stuff. It's not bad. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with it, but it's almost like it cannot justify its own existence. Why? Why is the Living Daylights? What is its purpose? What does it do? It doesn't really do anything. It starts, some stuff nothing happens. He goes to Berlin to work as a sniper, and he waits in a room for some guy to jump the border, and he, creeps on a good-looking girl. It's pretty boring, but yeah, fine. I mean, if you're, it's very short, and if you want to read the full James Bond canon, go right ahead and read it. It's not that bad or anything. Just not much happens in it. Right, that is it for my November roundup. That's all the stuff that I read in November, or almost all the stuff. I did read some other stuff, but I couldn't be boxed talking about it in this video because it would make it too long. And that's it.